Welcome to Voices of Resilience by Silver Screen Family, where we celebrate the remarkable stories of LGBTQIA+ elders. If you're as inspired as we are by these stories, please show your support by clicking the subscribe button below. By subscribing, you'll stay updated with our latest episodes and help us share these invaluable stories with a wider audience. Thank you.
So why do I wear all this colourful, these colourful markings? Well, just for interest, this watch band it's made by Apple. Funny enough, it's not an advert for them, but they call it the progress flag colours. So this is the rainbow flag plus trans and non-binary, queer and questioning, asexual, pansexual, and everything else. And so that's the first one. The second one I wear, although it's falling apart because I wear it so much, is just purely like a rainbow, the 6 colours of the rainbow that were adopted as representing LGBTQ+ people. And the badge, again, is the progress flag, minus actually a little black circle in the white bit, which you probably can't see from all the way over there, but which represents the diversity of race within the LGBTQ+ community. But the reason I wear them, and I wear them wherever I go, is to enable other people who are near me or see them to feel that it might be safe to talk to me if they think that might be in trouble, or if they've got a problem, or if they're just interested, quizzical. I also wear it to show that we do exist. When I'm in Pret, I'm the only one with all of this on, but am I the only LGBTQ+ person in there? Probably not. But I think it's good to identify, not just so that the other person who identifies the same way can just put the thumb up and say, yes, I know, you don't need to say anything, I get it, but actually other people, so that in amongst them is somebody representing the community openly. And I don't do it for any other reason than for visibility. Visibility is what counts. If we don't become visible in public, we get forgotten, we get ignored, we get not really thought about. And I think this is so important. It's what the early LGBT movement, after Gay Liberation Front and Stonewall and all the other things that happened in the late 60s, early 70s, and the early Pride marches, this visibility, the Pride March was a visibility. It wasn't just about we're all gay here and we all like each other and we all wear shorts. It's not. That's a bit of it, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's a lot about these people are your people. These people are your brothers, sisters, uncles, fathers, sons, daughters, nieces, cousins. We are you. And we're shouting out because if we don't, you don't see us and you don't reckon to what we need as a group of people, how we represent ourselves in society, how we need recognition and acceptance and support and tolerance and love like everybody else. But for too long, for 2,000 years nearly, we were virtually non-existent. And a lot of people say, well, all I see is all these LGBT things and rainbow flags everywhere and people on television kissing one another and so on and so forth. But that's what happens when you take the lid off of something that's been oppressed for a long time. And now is the time to keep showing it. And there will be a time we don't need to. But at the moment, I think we still need to show each other that we're here, we're not a threat. We could be helpful. So if you're gay or trans or lesbian and you're in a public place and you feel unsafe and you see me with all this clobber on, you know that you can come to me and I'll try and do everything I can to make you feel safe. That's why I wear them. My name is Michael David Parish. I was born in the spring of 1955, about 3 or 4 years after my brother. My parents did have a second child that was born naturally to them, but unfortunately he died, and their alternative was to adopt me from a woman who was about 20 years old at the time, but was single, and it wasn't the thing in the 1950s to have to bring up a child on your own as a single parent. Things have changed, thankfully. So I was unfortunately taken from her, and had a good childhood, and I did try to trace my natural mother when I was approaching about 30 years old, but learned that a year before I actually made contact with the family that my mother had already passed away. She had a thrombosis, which is something I need to look out for, because it's a kind of one of the only hereditary things that I know could affect me. So I'm very aware of my health associated with that. An interesting thing is that my name, Michael, was already given to me by her, but the family name was Cain. So I can often say in company, my name is Michael Cain. Not a lot of people know that. And indeed, there we go. That can be interesting. But and I've met other people with the same surname. Always wondered what that meant. The word Cain. The word Cain comes from tall, thin man in Suffolk and Norfolk, which is interesting because I'm anything but tall and thin. But there we go. So my brother and I had quite an interesting upbringing. Our parents were quite liberal, and I was still interested to find out who my family were. I did find out eventually that they had misgivings about me appearing on the doorstep, because when I did turn up to look for my natural mother, which I was allowed to do at that point, that not only had she passed away, but actually they didn't really want me to contact the family. I did manage to find the man she married eventually, who had 2 dogs, and one of them didn't like me very much, but was born on the same day and month as me, which was quite unusual. My natural mother had always said that if I turned up, that I should get something from them, which is always a bad thing, because I think they thought that's why I was there. I wasn't. I was there just to try and find out a bit more about my own history. And if you're adopted, it goes back as far as your own life, and that's where it stops usually. So what I did find out was that my natural father, they probably wouldn't want me saying this, was quite infamous, and had been in the Sunday newspapers like The People and the News of the World for various nefarious acts. So that made my interest even higher. And unfortunately, despite spending hours trawling through newspapers in the local area that I was born and having a very little bit of information, I still couldn't really find out who he was. But it's possible that I've got siblings who might look like me, and this is one of the things about being adopted, is you don't find facial similarities. In fact, people used to approach me and my brother and say, "You look very different," and of course we do. But it's also interesting. So that was a door shut for me, as to try and find out a bit about my natural history. The only 2 things I found out was that my grandparents kind of came from Newcastle and Plymouth. We couldn't get much further away from one another. One was in hotels, and the other, the only thing I know about them, that he was in the charge of the Light Brigade, which I find extraordinary. I didn't think they would be that old, but I suppose that's about right. So here I am in the new family with the surname Parish. The surname Parish, as far as I know, comes from northern France, and it's the completion of 2 words, Parish, which in France means not rich. In other words, poor. Hence the word we have in our country for parishioners, which is mainly from Middle Ages onwards, meaning the poor, the people who don't really have much influence, the people who go to church, but that's and they take their money, but that's about as far as their influence goes. So I'm now by any other intents and purposes, Michael Poor. But there we go. So it's Parish. My middle name was given to me by my uncle, my father's brother, who was a very tall, handsome chap who joined the Metropolitan Police, went to South Africa to work, and eventually came back to this country. And they had the high life. I remember going to Waterloo Station as a boy and getting on a steam train, which was about the thing in the sort of mid-early 60s, and then meeting them at Heathrow Airport, and they were dressed as very suave and sophisticated, coming off of a jet plane. It was a different world, and it was fascinating, and I had this longing to sort of do what they did, but that didn't quite materialise. But I'm still in contact with that family, so subsequent to that, as I was growing up, my parents didn't really get on very well. And by the time I was 15, they got divorced because of one thing or another. And at that stage, I didn't feel I could continue my schooling, even though I was doing okay. And I decided what I needed to do was to have independence from them as soon as I could. So at 15, I could go to work, and I did. And in fact, for my first interview, my mother came with me, which doesn't sound at all right, does it really? But it was a solicitor's company. I was basically the T-boy, but did a lot more than that. I used to take, when there was a house completion, this should show you how old it was, in Wandsworth in southwest London, they'd give me a bag of cash, like a satchel or a suitcase full of as much as £5,000, and go to the bank with it on my own down the high street. You wouldn't do that nowadays, and you certainly wouldn't be able to buy a house for £5,000, but it does show you how times have changed. But I learned a lot. I signed other people's wills, even though I was, I don't know, technically underage, I suppose. But I think I sort of learned the basics of, interpersonal relationships, how an office works, what it's like when there are people competing for authority in an organisation. And this extraordinary man who was the head honcho was a chap called Brigadier, because a lot of people carried their army names after them, so they would still be squadron leader or captain, or as in my school, the deputy headmaster was Colonel Coat Bond, not Colonel retired, or Coat Bond retired colonel. So and strutted around the school with a stick under his arm, much like you see sergeant majors do, and inflicted the most appalling brutality on the boys. But there we go. That was 60s demobbed military people turning to education as a means of continuing their sort of income and lives and careers. So demobbed, of course, from the Second World War and beyond. So the company I went to, the solicitors company, was in Wandsworth, wasn't far away. The head of the company was Brigadier Judd. I can't remember his Christian name, it'll come to me. And he used to have a napkin whenever he ate a grapefruit in the morning, and it was my job to bring that to him, half a grapefruit with sugar on, which wasn't really an office job, but there you go. But he'd get really, really angry every now and then and thump the desk, and I could hear it 3 floors up when he was not happy. And out would come this rather brusque, almost like Stephen Fry playing to the general kind of voice, complaining about things, was extraordinary. And I look back, although it was a bit scary, with some fondness for that, because that was my first exposure to life outside of a family. So eventually, after that, I actually joined the Greater London Council, and that was my career for life, basically, at that point. I didn't know it would be, and that was in 1972. So that was my beginning. My parents divorced at 15. I had a bit of a choice as to who I lived with. That was difficult, but in the end, I didn't have to go into court and say so, because you imagine how difficult that is. I don't want to live with that one, or I want to live with that one. It's a bit brutal. But as I say, that set me up for my own independence, and I think that was a good thing. And alongside all of this, was this emerging idea that I was different from everybody else, and I couldn't tell anybody. I knew from primary school that I was gay, and even when I was 15, 16 and 17, went out with girls because that's what you do, and it's how you kind of fit in order to sort of not rock the boat. My boat had been pretty well rocked by family discord and other things up until that point, and to add in another element of, risk to my life or risk to being rejected was not an easy thing to do. And so by 17 or 18, it was becoming imperative for me to do something about it. I think it's an extraordinary thing. At the time, I had no idea what being gay was. The only words I'd really heard were the words queer, which were very commonly thrown around. And the only visual signs of anybody who was gay would be somebody extremely flamboyant that I didn't really identify with. So in Monty Python, there'd be men dressing as women, with handbags and throwing things around and very high-pitched voices, or very camp characters on comedy programs. And none of this I identified with. So I didn't know really whether I was the only person who was like this that didn't want to dress up as a woman. And as naive as that sounds, that's actually, I wrestled with that, for a long time. And I wrestled with it on my own because there was nobody to talk to. There was nowhere to go, there was no knowledge, there was no information. I used to go to the library, partly to look at anatomical books about what men look like with nothing on. But it was also about trying to find out about the world of being gay. And the only book I found that my mother had, and I've only just remembered this, was a book by, I think it's Woman's Own, and they produced a book, or it might have been Woman's World or something like that. And in it, there were a few paragraphs about homosexuality. They weren't that negative, but they weren't that informative either. So there I was, making a way in my life with a big bit of it not in any way met by anything that I'd heard, seen, or anybody I knew. And by the time I got to 19, I was in Victoria Station, going down the escalators, looking at the pictures on the wall and the adverts, and every now and then there was a sticker which I saw initially. It was very small, about the size of 2 fingers, saying, if you're gay, if you think you're gay, ring this number. And to write the number down, there were no phones then, I had to kind of go up and down the escalator a couple of times and not look too obviously in case anybody saw me looking at these things, and walk past and take the next number and the next number, try and remember it. But I held on to that for weeks. I didn't do anything with that to begin with. This was the beginning, this was it. It's when I say this was the beginning of something I had no idea how it was going to turn out. Would this be could be the world opening up, or it could be a world of being somebody that wasn't ever going to be respected or recognised or loved or possibly rejected forever because of who I am. So it was a huge thing. I was still working at the time, and even in the early days, there were a couple of people that were coming out as gay at work, but I was terrified. I didn't want them to know me, and I didn't want to know them because other people would connect me with them, and then there'd be this risk that I'd be outed and all hell would break loose. And let's not forget, in the sort of mid-70s, even then, early to mid-70s, you could be sacked for being gay. It was just as simple as that. I knew people who had. Not then, but after I'd sort of got into the sort of the gay kind of closet at the time. So struggling on all fronts, trying to find my identity, trying to live authentically, not a lie. It's very unfair to do that to people when society says, you fit into this square, or we don't want to even hear what you have to say. It's not good for people. It's very bad for their mental health. It's very bad for psychology. So that was it. So by then, a few weeks later, I rang this group that called themselves Icebreakers, and somebody answered the phone, and I said, I think I might be gay, but I don't want to wear a dress or carry a handbag. And the man laughed at the other end. I can see now why he did. But I kind of didn't know what to make of that. And he said, oh no, that's all right. You don't have to wear a dress and carry a handbag. But if you come to this address on Sunday, we can promise you, you'll be among friends and it's safe. And you'll meet other people like you. But I still had no idea what that was. And in fact, I didn't go for the first 2 or 3 weeks. I rang again. I think I must have rang again to find out where the next venue was. The venue was in people's houses. So people who lived in London would open their house for a tea party every Sunday. And then, that was risky because they were having underage people and multiple people of homosexual. According to the law at the time, that could have got them into serious trouble. So that's another thought, that people trying to help were actually putting their lives on, their liberty on the line. But they did, and I'm thankful so much to them that they did do. And that Sunday I went was the first Sunday, and I sat on a very long couch, maybe 3 or 4 people on it, and at the other end of it, as I leaned forward to pick up my coffee, so did my future husband, who turned his head and smiled. And that was it. And we dated, mostly going out to food, to restaurants. He was so much more knowledgeable. He'd come down from Scotland, he'd been in the Merchant Navy, like me, to try and get away from the structure of family and the church, in his case, and society that was very negative. He thought he'd find this freedom in the Merchant Navy. It wasn't the case. He then came down to London, thankfully, and worked in a gift shop. So he was a very muscly, strong little chap with a bit of a Glaswegian accent, very adorable, very smiley and very kind. And he knew how to manage the relationship. I had no idea. And so we dated for quite a long time. And then I think I said to him that I told my mother that I wasn't eating very well. And that she said, oh, are you in love with somebody? And I said, yes, I am. Not to her, but to him, I told him. And that was it. And within 6 months, we'd moved in together in a flat in Balham in London. And that was the beginning of 47 years of a loving, wonderful relationship. So I'll come back to a bit more about the time that we spent there. But so to go back a little bit beyond my parents, so although I didn't have a specific contacts for grandparents, I did have grandparents on my mother's side and father's side. Both of them quite open-minded. All of my family were. I don't think they quite knew what being gay was, but they wouldn't have said anything negative, but nor would they say anything very positive. And I was too frightened to tell them anyway. But I remember my granddad, later, after I brought Tom home for one dinner at my mother's house, he'd been in the First World War, and I've got a picture of him with his Enfield rifle, almost as tall as him, standing at the front door in Acton with his hat on, all in uniform. So he was off to the, to the 1418 war, the First World War. I'd already got injured, but not too badly. He had shrapnel wound, and then by the time I think he recovered, the war was over, thankfully. But he lost part of his company, in the war. They were bombed, and the most appalling things. And he even showed me his little notebook, which was covered in mud, which is what these First World War trenches were like in the Somme in France. The worst of humanity, really. And yet this man survived that with the big heart. And he was every person's idea of a granddad. The tash and trousers up to about here, slightly rotund, but not particularly. But he had a happy disposition, whistled a lot, and was always kind. And we kind of talked a little bit around Tom and I being a gay couple in these early days. We're talking mid-70s. And he said, oh, I knew a couple of chaps in the army like that. Yeah, very nice people. Very, very nice, very kind man. I had a lot of time with him, and my grandmother. And he worked on the railways. I remember one occasion, two things that happened. Once, I think many years before that, my parents putting me on a potty in front of the fire in our house, and somehow or other I fell over and so did the pot, and it went everywhere. But that was kind of embarrassing, even though I was very young and had no control over that. But I also remember being maybe 6, 7, 8, and being given a boiled sweet and got stuck in my throat, and my granddad lifted me up by my feet and shook me until the sweet, and patted my back until the sweet came out. So I've a lot of reasons to remember him. Really foundational kind of person, very, very steady. And I think we all need somebody like that in our lives. And I know he was a great influence on my mother, I think, for that reason. So we're lucky when we meet people like that. And I was very lucky to meet another person like that in my husband, because he was very steady. Upstairs I have next to me a little a Pooh Bear, who's very calm, very slow, very relaxed. And next to Tom is a little piglet who's always rushing around all over the place. And we bought these for each other to reflect on how we are. So I needed the Pooh Bear to remind me to slow down, and he needed the piglet, not really to speed up, but just because that was there. It made sense to have those. So that kind of set us as very, when you're in a relationship, differences are as important as similarities. And people when you see people looking for a relationship, they're often looking for somebody who's exactly like them. And in fact, I'm not suggesting that won't work, but you also need differences, because that gives you scope to fulfill yourself, because you can't get everything from that one person. You need to sort of fill your life up with other things. And then you have even more. You've got the loving relationship that gives you so much, and then you've got other things which also give you lots of sort of spiritual support. So there we are. So that was when we moved into our house. I was born in Bovington, which is where the family still stayed, the Kane family. In fact, my father moved up there after the divorce. But so we moved from there, and I remember it would have been the 50s. Just the tail end of the 50s, I remember visibly relatives and friends coming to my parents' garden to have some sort of party. And I remember very distinctly the women wearing these very billowy 1950s polka dot type dresses. It's extraordinary how I can still remember that, because it made a huge impression. Everybody was very relaxed. Everybody looked very smart. And there were a couple who were my godparents, who I haven't seen ever since then, who were called Fred and Babs. They're like typical 50s names. But anyway, and then we moved to London. So by that time, which is when the divorce was more or less on the cards, and we lived in a house that had no carpets. It was quite cold. One fire which heated the whole house and also the water, and there were fights as to who would have the hot water. But there I learned, because I was also responsible for putting coal on the fire, me and my brother, and there was a coal scuttle that coal was delivered to from outside. And it was there I learned, because of what was happening in South Africa at the time, about economic sanctions. So in other words, if I didn't do filling the coal scuttle properly, I would get less pocket money, and my father would say, that's economic sanctions. So even as about 8 or 9 years old, I got to learn quite big words and what they meant. And it shows you how impactful things are on children. I think people maybe don't understand. I learned a lot about my own childhood, about when you talk to children, how they do take a lot in, more than you think. Other good things about childhood were 1963, I think. We got taken to see the Beatles. live in the Odeon in Leicester. The Odeon in Hammersmith. And I don't remember much other than screaming all the way through, and people standing in front of me. I was too short to see, but it wasn't all of the time. So we saw the Beatles singing most of their early sort of late 50s, early 60s songs, mostly the early 60s they'd already getting pretty famous, but not like the madness that happened after that. We also did a radio program, and a program that people my age would remember, which is Jukebox Jury, which was a popular music show, and I held a sign that used to have hit and miss, and you'd turn it over, you'd listen to a song, and there were famous people, I don't remember who they were, on the panel, as well as a chap called David Jacobs, who became a radio DJ for maybe 30, 40, 50 years. And it wasn't only, maybe less than 10 years ago, stopped doing that.
Darlings, welcome to a journey that's more dazzling than a Hollywood premiere. Picture a world where you can hear the echoes of great-grandparents' laughter, bear witness to your grandparents' daring adventures, and relive your parents' most cherished moments. This dream is not out of reach. It's the driving force behind Silver Screen Family. They swoop in like modern-day magicians, capturing these priceless memories and weaving them into films that will stand the test of time. These tales aren't mere anecdotes, they're vessels of wisdom and values. Through them, life's lessons are passed down from one generation to the next, a legacy more valuable than the finest jewels. Whether it's overcoming adversity, embracing change, or savoring life's smallest joys, these stories offer insights no classroom could ever replicate. Silver Screen Family is like your family's personal time machine, capturing stories in all their glory. It's like Netflix, but instead of binge-watching shows, you're binge-watching your family's greatest hits. Together, let's create enduring legacies that will touch the hearts of generations to come. Visit silverscreenfamily.com today and let Silver Screen Family help you create a lasting tribute to your loved ones. Don't wait. Start preserving your family memories now.
So my parents were pretty interested in, in culture and arts. My father was he did do acting for a bit, so there was a box of grease paint somewhere. A little bit more about that when he was a boy, which was before the Second World War, maybe late 1930s, late 1930s-ish. His mother took him to Hyde Park for a picnic, and he saw this couple, a man and his son, playing baseball or softball with a bat and the ball. And they looked to be having a great time, and he walked up to them. And the man said, "Oh, would you like to play?" in an American accent. And my dad said, "Oh, yeah, I'd love to." And so he started playing. And when he came back, after they finished, they went off, when he came back and sat down, and his mother said, "Do you know who they were?" He said, "No." He said, "That was Paul Robeson and his son." So, and Paul Robeson Jr. Would have been about the same age as my father. And then from the stage he did a few things. I think he met some really interesting people like Danny Kaye, who was a big American artist, among others. I'm sure he told me lots more than that. But his life went on to, after the divorce, he remarried, lived in Hertfordshire, so he went back from London back to Hertfordshire, where we all came from originally. And they spent many, many years together until my stepmother died in around about 2017 or 2018. And then he remarried at the age of about 92 to another person who is, she would argue she's not younger than me, but I'm pretty sure she is. I think a lot of people think that's pretty good going for somebody in their 90s. And she happened to have been a GP, in her life, so she was quite good at looking after people and doing health things. And at that stage, he needed a bit of health support. So my mother, in the meantime, she got remarried, but very sadly, within 6 months, my stepfather died. He had pancreatic cancer. Nobody knew. But she couldn't bring herself to sort of embark on another relationship after that. And she eventually moved to where we are now, which is in Somerset. Quite coincidentally, there was a house next door to my brother in a little village that was up for sale when she was she'd had pneumonia and she was convalescing, and she was looking for a future home, somewhere where she could be supported by family. So she moved down here, and I was the only one left in London at that stage with my wonderful husband, Tom. So for us, we met as I mentioned in about 1975. Lived together pretty quickly after that. I moved out from home, and we shared a flat. We then bought a house in Wandsworth, not far from where we rented our flat. And during all of this time, there was one occasion when I was invited. I was open at work by then, more or less, becoming to some people. And one of the guys was a very, very much into the political gay scene, and said to me, "Would you like to be on television?" And this was when I was about 23, 24 maybe. And I said no. He said, "Oh, it's Janet Street Porter. She's doing a documentary about young people, young gay people moving, out of their family home and setting up their lives." And bearing in mind, this was very new stuff. This was not on television in any big way at all. So I said to Tom, "Would you like to?" And he said, "Yeah, I'd love to." So he did. And he wore a shirt which said on it, "I'd rather be hated for who I am than loved for who I am not." In other words, I'm gay. If you like me, I love that. If you don't, I don't care. In other words, this is who I am, so stuff you, basically. And we put up with a lot of abuse, being called queer. I can't tell you how we, often in our lives, and I'm sure if you talk to a lot of gay people our age, it was relentless. It was hurtful, it was frightening. You couldn't come home from work on a bus together without somebody saying something. I don't know what it was. We weren't dressed flamboyantly. I think it was just two young men were basically easy targets. And if they could get away with saying that we were queer, whether they knew or not, of course they don't know. So we put up with a lot. When he was on television, the film kept panning around and he was smoking, because you could then on television, and then there's lots of interviews, but he didn't say anything. But his face was on there. And then within days, one of our neighbours who took umbrage to all of this then started calling us names, and then it went on and on and on. And that's what happened. You went public, you put yourself up above the parapet, you were going to be a target, and that's exactly what happened. And that, you either shy away from that and back off, or you say, I don't accept this. And eventually that turned me into an activist. It did for Tom already. He was involved in Gay Switchboard in London, opened in 1974. He was in London in 1974. He offered to be on the switchboard to help other gay people ringing in, just like I was, all distressed and not knowing who to turn to. And he was being trained. So he's in logbooks for Gay Switchboard in historical records now. So, and I'm going to be looking for those, interestingly soon. I've met somebody from Switchboard who's given me access to that soon. So that's going to be, I can't tell you how that makes me feel. I'm incredibly proud of him. He would not always put himself forward. He did when it counted. He would not shy away from confrontation, but he was good at mediating and keeping things and making things calm down. He was an activist in every sense of the word, and stirred in me this need to be honest, be truthful, be authentic, and stand up for what's right. And even though my parents were not narrow-minded, at the same time they weren't celebrating who I was. And there's a difference, you know. And I see things now with young people on television saying, you know, filming a TikTok thing of them telling their parents they're gay for the first time, and their parents throw their arms around them and kiss them and love them and tell them how wonderful they and proud they are. But a lot of older people never got that. They didn't get that affirmation. And so a lot of older people, which is where my life is now, face not only having been through rejection or at least not being celebrated, but being exposed in public and being in dangerous places because of dangerous thoughts and people, but facing now at my age group are going into care, you know, getting older, needing support, can't support themselves on their own. And I'll come back to the sort of work that I'm doing now, which is really activism in that field. But it comes from experiencing a whole lifetime of fighting and not have to fight in your last years of your life when you're vulnerable. That cannot be right, and that's what drives me and everything I do now. So I will come back to that in a minute. That's a very important thing. But in the meantime, you know, our lives were fantastic. We spent lots of years abroad, wonderful holidays, wonderful pictures, some films. And you never know, you know, how your life is going to turn out. You can't. I think if we did know how our lives are going to turn out, it may not be that helpful, to be honest, and just enjoy what you got when you can. And he gave me a really good, it was right when we first met, he gave me a really good bit of advice that I've always held on to, which is, you can't cage a butterfly. Now, it sounds a bit, well, what do you mean? Well, in reality, you know, if you try and stick something that's free, you know, we see butterflies as the essence of freedom and beauty and, you know, just enjoying the very few days that they live. Sometimes butterflies will live 24 hours. But if you caged it, you can't hold it as a beautiful thing. It is beautiful because of what it does and where it is and what it is. And he said that to me in a way that said, in our relationship, that if we try to control one another, if we try to box somebody in and make them do what we want, that this is not good. It will lead to it will possibly lead to the end of the relationship. And I thought that was very insightful for somebody who was 20 to be able to think like that. But he was an incredibly insightful, but also modest person. He would never tell you that he's, you know, anything that he's good at, but he was really good at lots of things. And we made lots of friends, a lot to do with him. He was one of these people who just walk up to somebody and befriend them, or if they looked like they were having problems, he would, you know, offer help. And we made many, many friends, very good friends. Thankfully, I still have them now. So we had a wonderful life, 47 years, but in 2006, we had a civil partnership before we knew anything about his health. And that was wonderful. We had 4 very good friends with us. We had it filmed and everything. It was fabulous. And very happy memories of that. And then 2 years later, he was having cognitive problems, which they thought was to do with an HIV infection that he got in 2003. And although I wouldn't go into detail about that, that was forced sex on him. It was in a situation where somebody had used a torn condom, but that's as much as I'd say. I've told other people. I think it's important for people to learn about that as well, to know that in some situations your safety is paramount. There weren't any medications at the time. They were just beginning. And by 2008, they were noticing in his clinic that his cognitive skills were declining. And they said, we think this might be HIV-associated neurological disorder, which is a common situation that people with HIV have. About half of people with HIV will have it, but it doesn't lead to anything other than very low levels of detectable cognitive inefficiency, if you put it that way. I don't quite know how you'd put it. But 2% of people with HIV who fall into that bracket will develop a dementia. And not many people know that. I think it's less so now because of the use of HIV medication, of course. But the more you've been exposed to HIV, and before you get the medication, the more the HIV goes into the brain, and then it has this damaging effect. We don't know, despite many, many, many tests, it was inconclusive. And eventually, 8 years later in 2016, he was given a diagnosis again by a neurologist, which matched that, a working diagnosis. But that still wasn't right. And in 2019 only, so look at this, nearly 10 years later, 9 years later, 9, 10, 11 years later, he had another diagnosis which said it was progressive supranuclear palsy, which is a very specific, very rare type of dementia, and almost certainly nothing to do with HIV. And that was awful, because not only did it rob him of his brain functions, but also physically. The body tends to tighten up, and it's very painful, and it's very hard. But my entire commitment to him was that, irrespective of the fact that I had a lifetime of love from him and support, when I had things go wrong, he was there. And so I said, well, I'll look after him at home. I don't want him going into care. I did a lot of research, and I found out, sadly, that for the last 30 or 40 years of recorded research in dementia, that anybody who went to a care home who identified as LGBTQ+ tended to fare very badly. Abuse, physical violence, being ignored, being ignored by or abused or verbally assaulted by not just staff and management, but also other residents in these environments. That was very scary, which is why I wanted to keep him at home. But reality is that if somebody has dementia, if they get a urinary tract infection, they may go to hospital anyway. And the likelihood is that once they're in hospital, they might get dispatched to a nursing home or a care home. And unless you have legal connections to that person, you may not have control over their health and welfare. So if I say nothing else, and if nobody else picks up much else from this, get a will, get a relationship legally in order, either a civil partnership or marriage. We eventually got a marriage conversion. And then also to get what they call a lasting power of attorney, because that gives you rights over connections to the person who is ill. It doesn't have to be dementia, it can be other illnesses. And unfortunately, there are still stories of couples have been together for 50 years who, once one of them is ill with dementia, goes into care, the family descend and then isolate that person, and the person they've been in a relationship for 50 years gets separated from their care and from their love and from all the rest of it. And even the staff in the home say, I'm afraid you've got no authority in here, even though you've been together for 50 years. I think if that doesn't tell you things still need to change, because it's still happening, then nothing will. And I will tell you, and I'll only make this the sad bit of the film, if you like. I hope not too much of this is sad. That some work I've been doing recently in dementia. I'd started a company which has got an incredible track record now in only a couple of years. But what we found recently is somebody whose husband went into care, similarly, got brutalised, beaten up, cigarette burns on their hands and their body. When it was investigated, another company produced a report showing 500 cases of abuse against LGBTQ+ people relatively recently, all witnessed accounts. The report is online and anonymised, so you don't get names in there. And this has now been put to our governance, in other words, to members of Parliament. It's been heard in a committee, and I am involved in a campaign to make this the last time that we have to hear these awful stories about older people who have gone through being in a society where, as I was, where up until 1967, when I was 12 years old and before, you could be arrested if you had sex with a man, to post that when we had the AIDS epidemic, then we had Section 28 preventing people from learning about what it was to be a gay person, even if you're young, to then, when you get older, having been active in changing society's understanding of what being a gay person is, what being a lesbian is, to then get to the end of your life and feel terrified and vulnerable and the object of abuse in a care home. Can't be right that people have been through all of that to then face it all over again. So if you've been out and proud all of your life to suddenly have to go back in the closet because you're too frightened for other residents to see that your husband turns up and gives you a kiss or holds your hand, can you imagine? Can you imagine? So if that's the only message that comes out that people see, please take note, because this still needs to change. There's a lot of work to be done. And there are a lot of people working on it, and I'm happy to say I think the tide is beginning to change, but it needs more work. And this is what I commit to. I commit to it because it's the right thing to do. I commit to it because of the love I have for my husband and what he went through. And I commit to it because it is wrong for society to have such disregard for humanity that by the time... I would think a care home, can you imagine the alternative to this frightening vision of going into care, that maybe you go to a care home where they have a drag act every Thursday night and dancing to disco music every Wednesday, and bingo with some funny sort of perhaps slightly rude quips from a drag queen. It could be fun. It could be completely the opposite. And I'm determined that this is how it could be. So there is a vision there, and I think it will be good for everyone. It's not just LGBT people, we know that. But I think on the back of this movement, we could see a change. And the company, you can see us online. We're about to have a new website made. It's being made for us by a very kind person at Brighton Switchboard, which is another fantastic place to go. If you have any worries about dementia, you can go to Opening Doors London, and if you look them up, you'll find that they have a website and peer groups. Same with Brighton Switchboard, and the same with Manchester LGBTQ plus Foundation. If you look at dementia and LGBTQ plus, you're going to find these organisations. 2, 3, 4 years ago, when I started, there was nothing. There were nothing there for people with dementia who were gay. I even went to Stonewall to put in the words dementia and LGBTQ. Not a thing came up. So we started the company. It's called the LGBTQ plus Dementia Advisory Group. We have a web presence. It's getting better. It will be a couple of months, maybe sometime in the autumn of 2023. It will look a lot better. But it is a point which you can find information. Contact us directly. Individuals will respond to you, and we'll do what we can to support you. And I'm very proud of that company. The people in it are exceptional. And in 2 years, we've gone from just trying to find our feet to actually having influence all over the country. In fact, even we now have, which was extraordinary, a referral from Stonewall itself. To me, that's a mark of having got somewhere. And I could tell you many other things. But so it's important. It's a big thing. It's a big thing in my life now. It's all I do now. So where did we go with Tom? So we had to move out of London because the house we had, it was perfect for what we wanted to commute to work. I could cycle to work in 20 minutes on the bike, faster than a car. And I tried it with a car, and it was no faster in the car. And Tom could get to work up near London Bridge. I was working in the Fire Brigade headquarters for a time in central London. And that house was perfect for that, but it wasn't perfect for looking after somebody with dementia. And I learned a lot about what that was like about looking after somebody. The first thing that happened in the house we're in now, which is where I'm sitting, previously was a hospital bed for Tom. whilst he was here in the later stages of his life. But the house here has good access for a wheelchair and a stair lift to get up to the upstairs. That we couldn't do in London, so we had to move. But that meant wrenching ourselves away from a lot of the support we had in London. But I'm happy to say, because there's a spare bedroom here, I get a lot of people who want to come for a short break in the countryside, which suits me perfectly, because they come for their break and I get their company. It's wonderful, and I'm so glad we did. And I've got my brother nearby, which is wonderful.
Hi, hello, this is Darren Brown. I just wanted to say I was one of the first people to have Danny come and film my parents for me. And it was one of the best things I think I've ever done. It was a really beautiful thing. It's a very discreet, lovely, gentle process. My mum and dad loved it. I actually did the interviewing, and sometimes Danny does that, but it was quite nice to do that myself. And I interviewed them both, and then together, and left everything in the hands of Danny, and he created this beautiful set of films, which I've now got forever. And with a young nephew growing up, it's going to be a wonderful way at some point for him to get to know his grandparents, and it will always be a beautiful thing to have. And the act of listening to their stories, quite aside from preserving them, but actually just listening to them and spending time with them and asking those questions and digging deep into their background and just finding out things that I didn't know was really wonderful. And now I've got a record of that forever. I really, really recommend it. It's a lovely afternoon. They are the nicest guys to have in your house. And it's Danny himself who comes over and does it, and clearly loves doing it too. So I hope you enjoy it as much as I did, and it comes to mean as much to you as it did to me. Thanks.
Never forget the people you love. Silver Screen Family.
A little bit maybe about my job in the fire brigade. It was an extraordinary, to begin with, it was a bit risky coming out because I was bullied at work, in the earlier part of my life. They won't like to hear that, but actually, people who were bullies, and we all know that they exist, and they are unfortunately amongst us. Sometimes we have to work out who they are in order to defend ourselves. But if your secret is something that they can use against you, it's a very invidious place to be. And I remember occasionally getting into maybe upstairs or a lift lobby or something, there'd be nobody else around, and in would walk this bully and say many things. One of them would be, the one I remember very particularly one day was, and I was about 35, I suppose, and he said to me, we're a bit worried about you, Michael, because you're not married. And this was a way of saying, I think I know that you're a gay man or a puff or queer or whatever he would have said otherwise, but slightly inhibited. So this was another way of making me feel uncomfortable and frightened, because that's what bullies do. And I'm afraid at that time, because if I came out, there was no protection in the fire brigade for the management to find a way of sacking me because I was gay. There's a troublemaker, there's somebody who doesn't really fit in because I'm gay, etc. It's not true, I did. I did a lot of talks and training people, and eventually, without trying to sound too immodest, the support I had from my colleagues later was second to none. I can't think of a nicer crowd of people to work with that I worked with. But it was frightening to begin with. And remember, I started working around about 1970 when I was 15. It wasn't until 2010 that we had the Equality Act that protected people in their work legally. So technically, I had spent the most of my life working with the risk that people could alienate me, make me feel uncomfortable, frighten me, possibly work out a way of getting me to leave an environment because I didn't like working alongside a gay man. As it happened, the brigade became a wonderful place. I did things which I never thought I would do, extraordinary things, getting thrown in a car with a blue light and a siren here and there. I know it was scary as hell, but also a huge responsibility, looking at ways to make people safer, planning for emergencies, and things that, some of it I can't really talk about, but I felt very privileged to working in an organisation which had such huge public, support and care for, and working with heroes, so many of them are putting their lives at risk for other people. It's a very extraordinary place to be in, and I felt very lucky. And as I say, after that first period when it was very scary, it became a very good place to work, and it's probably one of the best. High up there on the agenda for Stonewall, for being a good employer for LGBT people, such that they would dress up a fire engine up on Pride parades and invite us to walk beside it in the parade with other fire officers who are identified as LGBT. What more could you ask from an organisation that has such public esteem, and to be part of that? Wonderful. So huge pride in having worked for that organisation. And I still have contact with my colleagues. I left 9 years ago, I think this year, believe it or not. I find that difficult to believe. But I still have contact with some of them. So these are two, I think they're gorgeous. I mean, it's actually a paperweight. I don't use it as that, but they're both awarded from the Fire Brigade for the amount of time that I've worked there in recognition of my time there. This one is for 20 years and came with a certificate, which I have, and this one is for 40 years. This came with a party and a shaking of the hand of the commissioner. So, but they are important to me. You can't buy these. Well, you probably can on somewhere on eBay, but they won't mean as much to you if you can't say that I belong to an organisation that had prestige, and the public has it in their heart and feel very proud of it. And they looked after their employees and respected them, and I think that's wonderful. Tom's work, he worked in the health service. The different story for him was that when his cognitive skills were declining, he was being given new work and he'd have difficulty understanding it. He'd come home in tears. This was at the beginning, around about 2009 or 10. And I was puzzling, what's going on? He's not like this normally. And before any investigation was done about why this was happening, his employer was threatening to demote him or sack him because he wasn't living up to his responsibilities. And yet, actually, as an employer, for somebody who has a disability, you can't sack somebody for a disability. You have to make adjustments for them. So they were going against all of the protections that are in place for people, in employment. When they've done nothing wrong, they get ill. You don't sack people because they're ill. But one wonders, well, maybe there's a bit of homophobia there as well. You can't help thinking that whenever something negative happens to you if you identify as a sexual minority or gender minority, you can't help thinking, your thought processes go from, I wonder it's because they don't like the fact that I'm gay, and then you go on to other things. You kind of start with that. And for that, that's what we did. So we did a lot of things. I went with him, talked to his union, talked to his managers. And eventually his clinic said it would be inhumane to keep Tom working given his cognitive decline. And thankfully they retired him on medical grounds, and he spent a few years at home quite happily on his own, doing his little hobbies. And then eventually, after a few very big sort of situations that were very shocking for me, as his husband and loving partner, I decided to retire to look after him, and that was I started in 2015, and that lasted until 2022 when he died. 7 years of daily support that got increased over and, as the years went by, to it was exhausting at the end. But when you love somebody, you don't give up. You do what you can to make somebody comfortable and love and feel safe, and that's what a relationship does. It gives you that strength to do that. And I was very lucky that I've got pictures of him, and it sounds awfully morbid, but it's not really. Within a week before he died, he was taking quite a lot of morphine and other medication to sort of ease the pain and everything. But even then, and he'd lost an awful lot of weight. I still have a couple of photographs. I was very candid, I was very aware that it wasn't right to film somebody or photograph somebody who was that ill, but I wanted to have these pictures in case I needed to see them. Who knows? I didn't know. Nobody tells you, take a picture now, because if you don't, you're never going to remember it. And there he was smiling, even though he was going through all of this suffering. And I took a couple of pictures, not many. And I talked to him and I asked him if it was okay. He couldn't answer, and I'm glad I did, because it reminds me, the humanity in people who have dementia. Don't ever write somebody off who has dementia. I've seen people who, when their friend develops dementia and they ring them up and say, are we going shopping, maybe 10 times, and they say, no, I've told you already. And you get that kind of story with people with memory problems, is don't give up on them. That's not them, and that's not all of them. That's the bit that's gone wrong. The rest of them is still there. And we need to understand that about people with dementia. It's a very important thing. And I'm glad to say a lot more is changing. I'm glad to say that, the pathway is not so painful. But as I say, I think if this is happening in your life, even to somebody you know, get them in touch with people that can help, because it means everything. You can't really do this alone. But we had people coming in, district nurses every day, and they were so gentle, kind and loving and very supportive of our relationship, even though every time I opened the door to a stranger, because of our history, I'd think, I wonder if we're going to be okay with this person. What if they're going to say something, or maybe they'll be a bit flippant and not really understand us, but actually they did. So it's there. The kindness is there, and the support is there. But your story, one story gets painted. Your picture of your story gets painted for you by things that you can't control, and you find strengths and things in you that you didn't think you had. Some of the skills I had when I worked come into play with what I do now. So those skills, I'm glad I had them. I learned how to be a teacher. I taught at university. I still do. I'm a voice for the local carer centre and for other carers here in Bath. I've been on the radio about the carer centre recently, and also I go to university and talk to students in the first and third years about what it's like to identify like this and have dementia in your family. And that's because these people are going to become social workers eventually. And I'd like to think that when I say to them, when you knock on the door and you come to the room and there's two people of the same sex in the house, don't make an assumption. Ask if you want, or hint at, or invite somebody to tell you, but don't make an assumption. I had, with Tom, people looking at us, very kind intentions. One said, I think it's wonderful how you look after your father like that. And others who said, is that your brother? Or is that your friend? And not my lover, not my husband. It hurts a little bit, and I think we've got a little way to go. But best not to make an assumption. That's the simplest way. Then it's not frightening or hurtful. So a couple of interesting things that happened in our lives. It's a long time ago, but in 1978 we got invited by a friend to go to Elton John's house for a party. And several times, in fact. Would you like to come to a party this weekend? It's at Elton's house. Where is it? Oh, it's in Datchet in Windsor, in West London. Oh, I don't think I can. My car is an old crate. I can't possibly turn up at Elton John's house in an old Ford Cortina that is barely functioning. Oh, God, of course you can, of course you can. Now, I didn't know the person was asking us was a friend of ours. We'd kind of lost touch, but he got back in touch. He was actually his boyfriend at the time, also called David, funnily enough. And he worked in social services in Ealing Council, I'll tell you that much. Anyway, so one day I gave in, and Tom and I got in the car and drove in the sort of late winter time, all the way to Datchet on the M4, turned off, got the address. I've still got Elton John's phone number on the board over there, interesting, and a picture. And got to the front gate and pressed the buzzer and said, oh, it's Mike and Tom, and Elton John answered, said, wait for the door to open, drive up Elton Road and park the side of the house, the mansion. So we did that, walked in, it was already dark by then, went in, we had dinner that was all served on a marble table with a marble floor with this tortoise about this big, probably gold and covered in diamonds, and you just press a little tail and it made a noise. And in came all this food, and there was drinking, I was quite drunk. And then Tom and I walked around the house and looked at all these Da Vinci drawings without glass on, Hockney paintings, a swimming pool, pianos. It was amazing. Then we sat down and watched Coronation Street with Elton John. He liked that. And had this huge balloon glass of very old brandy. By that time, his manager, John Reed, had turned up. And so we all went down to his disco, which was in the basement. And everything, even stuff from his film Tommy was there, you know, the pinball machine and these huge boots. And it was all over the place. So we clearly couldn't go back that night. I was completely drunk. And so we all managed to find somewhere to sleep. And in the morning, came down to breakfast, and Elton John was cooking breakfast, and we all sat around and chatting and everything. And then, so Tom and I had said, oh, I suppose you better go. And he said, okay. He said, it's lovely to meet you and all that. He's very, very nice. I can tell you, delightful, delightful, delightful man. A really lovely, down-to-earth, lovely man. And we left, got in the car, very cold, turned the key and it wouldn't start. On and on and on. So eventually the door opened to the kitchen at the side of the house, and Elton John walked out. He said, what's the problem? I said, it won't start. Now, I think he said, you can borrow one of my cars if you like. There's his car's in this garage, like a sports car, which his boyfriend at the time had. I said, oh, no, I can't. I'm that kind of person, I can't do things like that. So he said, I'll try and give you a push, because it was slightly downhill towards the gate. So he pushed the car and eventually it bump started and off we went. So when I'm asked for something that's a bit what other people might not have ever done or ever heard of, or was a bit difficult to visualise, was that Elton John bump started my car. So that's a small part of a bigger story. And in fact, we did get subsequent phone calls to come and spend time there, but I couldn't. He said, well, I'll send a car for you. Don't worry, there'll be a car to our little house in Balham, which wasn't very nice, with lino on the floor. To me, it just didn't. The two worlds were just so far apart. But that was wonderful. So so that was an extraordinary time, and kind of lived off the memory of that for a long time, because it was important. And even as a boy, I was in the choir at school as long as I stayed at school, which wasn't for very long. I was in the choir, and I remember waiting to go in to sing some music by Benjamin Britten, who's regarded as probably the most significant British composer ever. And he came, we were waiting in a sort of an ante-room to the church where he was going to play the piano and the semi-chorus was singing. And before that was happening, he walked into the ante-room and sat down next to me and talked to me, which was extraordinary. And then went in, we sang, and I've got a photograph of Benjamin Britten and me and my choir master all together in a line, which is quite something. And sung with conductors like Sir Colin Davis. Some of the people know these and Sir George Sholty. I've been on records, on television, radio. In that short time I was in secondary school with a voice that hadn't broken, and sang at St Paul's Cathedral, the Albert Hall, every one of those big venues. So those are very big memories. And I still have an interest in music. I'm not that good at it. My hobbies have been painting, many other things, a bit of music, but I'm not very good at them. So I'm not too good at hobbies. I lived my life through my partner's hobbies. He collected meteorites and gemstones and fossils. They are all over the house and in storage. There's an awful lot of them, and I loved them as much as he did. So that was our... Yeah, so we had we had very different lives, but they were like in synchromesh. They worked together very well. We were both independent, but both very dependent. It's a kind of a peculiar mixture of both things, which I think is a lovely, a tribute to him, because he's the one who's sort of very good at making things happen, and hence why everything I do is about him now. This was a gift that I was given when I retired. Bear in mind, I'd retired a bit earlier than most. I knew what was coming my way in terms of what was at home with my wonderful husband and his illness, but he was still pretty okay even at this time. And I didn't want a big send-off. I'm not that kind of person. It feels a bit selfish to do something like that. But they did it anyway. They bought loads of food and loads of bunting and things, and they pretended that I didn't know what was going on, but I kind of worked out there was something going on in this room next to the control room that I was working in. And my heart sank. I was feeling very self-conscious about that as I was escorted to the room. And there were some lovely things being said, and then a bunch of presents on the table, wonderful things. This one, I sort of opened one or two, and that's wonderful things. There was a newspaper from the time I joined the organisation, a reprint of it. There was this fabulous card signed by the commissioner, which was an unknown at the time. That was the influence of my boss, who was an amazing chap. And then, as I was sort of talking and rumbling through all of this stuff and looking at all the faces and feeling that sense that, this was a big thing, I opened this up and I was about to say my speech, I hadn't got a speech. I had this idea of what I might say to thank everybody. And I opened my mouth and burst into tears when I saw this. This is a thought square. It's made up of the two badges of the Fire Brigade that existed but were updated in the time that I started from the Fire Brigade, 1972 onwards. And in it, they talked to loads of different people, and each of them put a word that they thought about me. It was a kind of a word that they would equate to having known me. I'm not going to be so immodest as to read any of them, but it's a beautiful thing, and it's a pride of place, because we all need reassurance from other people. None of us is completely able to do everything on our own and be self-sufficient 100% of the time. And when you receive something like this, it tells you what impact you have had on other people. And in our lives, I think that's as important as our happiness internally, is knowing that other people you've had an effect on other people that's been positive. You can't always know that. People don't always say so. Even if you've done a wonderful thing, and they might give you a thank you or smile, but you don't really know how they feel until you receive something like this. And this is very important for me. And when I'm feeling a bit down, I remember this and I look at this, and my self-esteem is boosted endlessly. So I am eternally grateful to my colleagues for this.